just by brief way of introduction, I work for the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. We have 35 member countries, and broadly speaking, we are a forum for exchange of ideas on how to govern countries and how to make lives better for people. So my main objective today, I want to talk about how we turn this concept of happiness into something very concrete and something that can be applied in public policy. I think it's been noted with a couple of different presentations that actually what we're talking about with happiness is really quite different to where we are at the moment in terms of public priorities and the way that governments think about their jobs. So we've got quite a gap to fill in terms of where we are now and where we want to be with the happiness agenda. And what I'm going to present when my slides magically appear is essentially the OECD aim to fill that gap. Okay. The reason this is challenging is that it takes us back to a fundamental question around what makes for a good life. And this is difficult stuff. Arguably, some might say it's best left to the philosophers. But the challenge is that governments implicitly answer this question every time they spend money. So we can't leave this in the hands of just economists who tend to be the ones who are advising governments on how to spend that money. There needs to be a much broader dialogue around what makes for a good life. Now, trade-offs are inevitable when resources are scarce. And let's be clear, in government, resources are always scarce. So you're always making trade-offs in terms of where you allocate your resources. So one of the goals of our work on wellbeing is to try and help governments make the choices more explicit. So to try and prepare the evidence that means governments understand when they make a choice to invest in one area, what impact that has on people's wellbeing. So we're trying to develop a framework through which we can understand how you get better policies for better lives. In 2011, the OECD got a new mission statement, and that new mission statement was better policies for better lives. That all sounds great, and it's very easy to make promises about raising people's well-being and increasing people's happiness. We really have to make it concrete in order to hold people to account for those promises. It's very easy to say we need to provide a mechanism by which people can actually do it. The other thing to say is that we need an agreed definition and measurement that actually speaks to people's realities. So on the one hand, we need to connect with individuals, with communities, with voters, in terms of speaking to their reality, how they feel life is going. But it's also really important that we speak to the reality of policymakers. And the reality of policymakers at the moment is still this number, GDP. We've heard a lot about it already, but I do want to reiterate that this is front of center for most OECD governments, and what they want to know from us as an organization is, how do I boost this number? That is still a live issue, and it matters. It matters because it's associated with jobs, it matters because it's associated with paying you your pension, and it matters because it's also associated with tax revenue and therefore public money. So the spending that governments can do relates to this number. So this number is still very much the reality that policymakers are facing. Of course, we know that as a measure of welfare, of how lives are going for people, GDP has its limits. It fails to show any information about the distribution of the benefits of growth across society. It, of course, doesn't speak to the issue of sustainability and whether or not growth is achieved in an environmentally friendly way. There are a range of issues that GDP simply cannot capture. So things that people value, like their social relationships, those aren't traded in markets, they don't come with prices, we can't count them as part of our GDP figures. So it's definitely very inadequate as a measure of people's welfare and as a measure of people's well-being. So we need something that bridges the gap between this number here, GDP, and this concept of happiness. And this takes us into uncharted waters. So what the OECD is trying to do is offer a stepping stone, if you like, a way to try and capture well-being, this better lives thing, that relates to the reality that policymakers face at the moment, but also relates to the reality that people feel on the ground. So trying to capture what makes life good for people. Now, this is the framework that we've developed, and I have to say we really can't take credit for this framework in the sense that it's a product of a consensus process around what various different approaches to thinking of this concept of well-being and happiness, the various different components that they've come up with, we've kind of brought them all together in a framework. So this is a product of a lot of philosophical thinking, but also a lot of economic thinking, and it also reflects a lot of the initiatives that are happening across OECD countries to try and measure well-being and happiness. So what do I need to tell you? First of all, you can see there are two big components in this framework. The first is individual well-being today. So this is current well-being here and now, and it's measured at the sort of individual and community level. In the bottom half of the framework, we can see sustainability of well-being over time. And this is about having the resources for future well-being, making sure that the different capital stocks that fuel well-being, that drive well-being, are actually preserved for future generations. So there's two components. There's how people are feeling here and now, and the sustainability of well-being over time. As you can see, it incorporates many of the things that governments already care about and they already spend money on. But there's also a few new things in there that governments typically don't have front and center. So on material conditions, we've got classic measures like income and wealth, measures that tackle issues of jobs and earnings and also housing. On quality of life, we've got a range of different dimensions, so things like health status, work and life balance, education and skills, civic engagement and governance, social connections, environmental quality, personal security, and of course, subjective well-being. When it comes to the resources that sustain well-being over time, we look at 4 different types of capital stocks. So we're looking at natural capital, natural resources, we're looking at economic capital, we're looking at human capital, so the skills, knowledge, and health of people, but we're also interested in social capital. So the connections, the relationships between people that actually make all of this function effectively. So key features of our measurement approach, we're focusing on people, not just the economic system. So we're trying to look for indicators that capture people's experiences of their lives, not the economy on aggregate. We're interested in showing the diversity of experience, and in particular, we try and always make sure that we're reporting on inequalities, not just averages. So we care about the average level, but we also care about how these different sort of goods, if you like, are distributed in society. So wherever we can, we break down our data by gender, by age, by income level, by education level. So we try and capture the different experiences within different groups of the population. We have an emphasis on objective conditions. So a lot of our measures are objective measures. But we also have subjective measures in there because you can't talk about people's experiences of life without actually asking them about their experiences. So self-report data is a crucial component of our framework. It's not the only thing that's in there, but we recognize that it's essential to ask people how they're doing, and that involves looking at their happiness and their subjective well-being. As I said before, it's concerned with well-being both today and tomorrow. And importantly, what we're doing here is trying to develop a list of ingredients for a good life rather than necessarily a prescriptive recipe. I think this is important because I think we have to recognize, and again, we've heard it a little bit today, that different people might have different definitions and different ways of thinking about what happiness means to them. So we need to recognize that these different ingredients might be combined differently by different people. Nonetheless, the OECD very frequently gets asked for a single indicator of well-being or happiness. We are very frequently asked, what's the happiest country? What's the most sustainable country? We know that country rankings are terribly popular. But this is really difficult stuff because it means deciding whether, for example, health is better than education or deciding whether safety matters more than happiness. That's not a decision that it's safe to leave in the hands of policy analysts or economists or psychologists, philosophers or politicians. It has to be an open dialogue. So what was the OECD's solution to this issue of needing a single number? Well, we built a website where people can decide for themselves what makes for a good life. So it's called the Better Life Index, and you can see there's a link to the web address there. Just talking you through it a little bit, broadly, when you arrive at the website, you get offered this dashboard. And the idea is that on this interactive toolbar, you can move the cursor to show how important the different topics in our framework are to you as an individual. So there's then an algorithm that combines the weights that the website users provide us with to give you that all sought after country ranking. So at the end of the day, you do get a rank, but it's not one that the OECD decides. Our data drives it, but the people visiting our website are actually determining what formula goes into the generation of that rank. So instead of showing you an Excel spreadsheet of data, and those are available if that's your thing, we also provide those, but instead of that, here we show you flowers. And the height of the stem of the flowers is an overall summary of the well-being that you get as a result of filling in your ranking. And then the size of the different petals on the flower tell you the scores on each dimension of well-being. So we have a fancy color coding system for anyone who is interested. So what do people say matters most to them? Well, we launched the website in 2011, and since then we've had 9.5 million visitors to the site. We don't automatically collect ranking information whenever people are just playing with the tool on our site. So we don't automatically pull in that data. But people have the option to share their index with the OECD if they want to. And we've got about 120,000 indices now that have been built and that people have shared with us. So that gives us a little bit of information about what people in different countries are feeling is mattering most to them. What's the headline message here? Well, the phrase we tend to use is that people want to be healthy, happy, and wise. The three sort of top scoring dimensions in our framework are health, life satisfaction, and education. But I think the other takeaway message from this exercise for us is that there isn't a single dimension that people say is totally unimportant. They all count. So the red line on this chart is the score that you would get if everybody was rating every dimension perfectly equally. So there are differences in people's ratings, but on the whole, almost every dimension attracts some interest from everybody. So I'm from the Statistics Directorate. I have to tell you there are some big caveats about using this kind of data. The first one is we have not by any stretch got a representative sample of people visiting our website. We know it takes a special kind of person to visit the OECD website. We only have it in 7 different languages. We're only attracting certain groups of society. We tend to have more men than women visit the site. We tend to have more younger people than older people visit the site. So there are things we can measure that we know are biased in this sample, but there's an awful lot of things that we can't measure that also tell us this is an unusual group of people who are sharing their views with us. But nonetheless, it's kind of interesting. The other thing we do actually on the website is that you can see how people in different countries are ranking the different dimensions. Again, bearing in mind these are not representative samples, but in both the USA, Canada, and Mexico, we've actually got quite sizable numbers of people sharing their index with us. So we've got over 6,000 people in Canada and Mexico, and in the US we've got over, I think, about 20,000 people responding. Again, this idea that people want to be healthy, happy, and wise seems to come through very strongly. So in all 3 countries, we've got life satisfaction, health, and education coming out towards the top. It's interesting that we've got a slight difference between Mexico, Canada, and the United States in terms of what comes out right at the top. So in Mexico, we see education as being the most highly valued. In Canada, it's health. And in the United States, it's subjective well-being, life satisfaction, or happiness. So it seems appropriate that we're here. Further down the rankings, we often see that work-life balance and safety are quite important across these countries. And then down sort of towards the end of the rankings, we do see some differences, but on the whole, there's a lot of similarity. And again, we see this right across the OECD. There's a lot of similarity in the way that people are ranking these different dimensions. So how do OECD countries measure up? Well, the Better Life Index that I've just been showing you is meant to be a fun introduction to our work. It's meant to be an accessible way to understand what we do. But there's an awful lot that happens behind the scenes. And for a much more in-depth look at how we measure well-being and actually how life is going in the OECD, we produce a book every 2 years, and that book is called How's Life? So we're busy at the moment actually writing the 2017 edition. What I've shown you here is the 2015 edition. And what we do every time we produce this book is actually go through dimension by dimension, indicator by indicator, how are people doing in OECD countries, how is life in the OECD. We also look at how well-being is distributed in these countries and also how it's changing over time. We've got another section that looks at these resources for future well-being and the extent to which countries are providing the necessary investment in those resources. And then we tend to have special focuses. Each year we produce the book, we have a different sort of set of special chapters. And in 2015, we had a special focus on the lives of children. So how's life for children, applying our framework at the child level. We had a special focus on volunteering and well-being, so both what's the relationship between volunteering and well-being, but also who benefits. And one of the things we find is that actually volunteering is associated with higher well-being for the individuals who volunteer as well as the people that they help. And we also had a special focus on measuring well-being in regions, so looking within a country at regional disparities in well-being. Now, in the time available, I can't possibly show you all of the results, but I can't also leave without showing you any data at all. So I've got a picture here of the relative performance of the United States on current well-being and how we define current well-being. So one of the strong messages that comes across from all of the work that we've been doing is that every OECD country has some room to improve in terms of people's well-being. There isn't a single OECD country, even Norway, even Sweden, even Switzerland, that does amazingly well across all of our measures. Every country has areas of strength and areas of weakness. So for the USA, we can see some areas of comparative strength. So this is how the US is doing relative to other OECD countries. So this chart actually shows if there's a long bar, that means that it's an area of relative strength for the country. If it's a short bar, that means it's an area of relative weakness. So in the USA, we can see things like household income, financial wealth, earnings, and also stakeholder engagement in government activity. Those are all high-scoring areas for the US. Areas of less good performance, comparatively speaking, in the US include work-life balance indicators, so both the proportion of people working long hours, and we define that as regularly working more than 50 hours a week, and also time off, which is time spent on leisure and personal care. Those are both relative weaknesses for the US. Also life expectancy, which is in contrast to strong scores on perceived health in the US, life expectancy is well below the OECD average in the US. Also, homicide rates in the US are much higher than the OECD average. So that just gives you a little bit of a flavor of sort of some of the things that we do with the data, but it's a snapshot only. And I would say anyone who's interested, talk to me and I can provide you with a copy of the book. Why do this? Again, I think it's really important to emphasize why this matters. I don't think it's enough to just say, we're right, happiness is the answer, well-being is the answer. I think we actually need to demonstrate what you can do with this data and why it will actually make a difference. So what are the advantages of this approach? One issue is it's offering a more complete picture of progress. So we're trying to capture aspects of life that often aren't represented in policy. That includes things like social connections and work-life balance, but also subjective well-being and happiness. We think it can help to support the strategic alignment of outcomes across government. So by clarifying what it is you're aiming for, what it is you think matters, can actually help different government departments come together on an agreement about what they're trying to achieve. And at the very least, it provides us with a checklist that all government departments should be using when they're thinking about the impact of their policy. They're not just thinking in terms of, oh, I'm the health department, so I'm going to think about health. We're actually saying you need to think about the whole of your well-being impact. So my slide has slipped a little bit, but that's meant to say highlighting the diversity of experience at a granular and people-centered level. So this might sound like a bit of an oxymoron, but we're looking for statistics that people can relate to. We're trying to find ways of communicating about how life is going for people. And I think in this sort of post-truth era that we're in at the moment, it's even more important that we're thinking about how we communicate, but also how we listen to people in terms of what they say matters for them. And finally, as I've mentioned before, it's a forward-looking framework. So we're not just looking at happiness here and now. We are trying to also capture the resources that matter for people's well-being in the future. Again, I'm from the Statistics Directorate, and we're trying to be the change we want to see. And that means trying to improve the availability of data. It's really important that we try and give policymakers the best possible evidence we can. So I've highlighted a couple of different publications here. Probably the most interesting for people in this room is the work that we've done on measuring subjective well-being. So back in 2013, we produced some guidelines on measuring subjective well-being. These were designed with national statistical offices in mind, and we've now reached a situation where 34 out of 35 OECD member countries are collecting data on subjective well-being in their national statistics. This is a radical change from how the situation was even just 5 years ago. So there's impact that we're able to have by explaining how you go about measuring these concepts. You can actually start to make a difference in the flow through of evidence that will eventually reach policy, but we are still in the early stages. A couple of things that we're also doing that will be coming out in 2017, we're actually producing some guidelines on how you measure trust. Again, we've heard a little bit today about the interest in measuring trust. That's a very challenging concept, but we've been doing some work to sort of identify a statistical framework so that you can actually go out and try and measure these things. And also maybe of interest is work that we're doing on measuring the quality of the work environment, because people spend an awful lot of their waking hours at work, and so well-being at work is a crucial determinant of well-being in the rest of life. So quick conclusion, measuring what matters. To make happiness a policy goal, we need to define it and we need to measure it. And we can have different views on what that is and how we define it and measure it. But we need to be clear because we need to be able to hold people to account. If I make a promise to raise people's well-being, you need to know what I mean when I say that, and you need to be able to hold me to account for doing it. This necessarily means talking about what people value, and that can't just be decided by economists and statisticians or even just by data. I think one of the strong advantages of subjective well-being measures is that it is reflecting how people feel about their own lives. There is no judgment there. There is no framework imposed by the OECD on what makes your life good. It's an individual's assessment of their own life. So that's a key strength for those measures. As I said before, the OECD Wellbeing Framework is a list of ingredients. It's not a prescriptive recipe. It's about making choices and trade-offs in policy more explicit, and it's about trying to generate a more open debate about what matters most and how we achieve it. Thanks very much.
Thank you.